First World War, British trade unions looked strong and powerful, even London's tea shop girls. Union membership had almost doubled. Some unions, like the Transport and General Workers Union, had formed into larger units. In 1919, the miners, the railwaymen and the transport workers renewed what they called the Triple Alliance, a formidable weapon against the employers. But the unions were not as powerful as they seemed. Their leaders lacked experience, and there were difficult times ahead. After a brief post-war boom, living standards began to fall, and by 1926, there were nearly 1 million unemployed. The unions were forced to accept wage cuts, and a feeling of bitterness began to grow. The worst problems were in the coal industry, where many pits were too small to be efficient, and the owners had neither the will nor the money to modernize. Overseas markets for coal had been lost during the war. Ships were going over to oil, and coal prices fell. Miners' working conditions had always been bad. 2 out of every 100 miners working underground were killed. Another 25 would be seriously injured or crippled by industrial disease.
Your mother used to have to wash your back when you got home, and mine she had to be very careful because it had scabbed with hitting the top, with hitting the roof. We see the top, you see? And your shirt used to get stuck into it as well. And the scab used to get on, you should try and avoid knocking it off. But it was impossible, man. And the wet off the roof, dropping onto you, and the raggy planks bumping them, and the water over the shoe tops. You know what, you couldn't describe it. They wouldn't do these things today. We were just bloody slaves, man, that's what we were.
In April 1926, the coal owners proposed to solve their problems by reducing wages and increasing the miners' hours at work. A.J. Cook, the fiery miners' leader, who himself had worked 21 years in the pit, rejected this proposal outright. The miners can bear no more. It is better to starve than to live on the terms you offer. Not a penny off the pay, not a second on the day. On April the 30th, the owners locked the miners out. Pit ponies came up from the darkness. The Conservative government declared a state of emergency. Next day, at its headquarters in Eccleston Square, the TUC, who had already promised to back the miners, ordered a general strike in their support. Most of the TUC General Council were cautious men, certainly not revolutionaries. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, was anxious for a settlement. But some cabinet ministers, including Winston Churchill and the Home Secretary, Sir William Joynson Hicks, were suspicious. They called us revolutionaries, the British worker said. Sooner or later, this question has got to be fought out. Is England to be governed by Parliament and the Cabinet or by a handful of trade union leaders? While the government prepared for the struggle ahead, May Day demonstrations gave the unions a chance to show their strength. Volunteers were ready to run emergency services, like the buses. Their work was to be coordinated from town halls all over the country. Special constables were appointed to maintain order. Since 1925, the OMS, the Organization for the Maintenance of Supplies, had been registering and training volunteers for use in an emergency. The volunteers had to fill in a form like this.
This is a form we had to fill in. I remember one doing this quite well. The OMS is neither political nor aggressive. Its purpose is the compilation of a classified register of its members for the use of the government of the day should a state of emergency be declared. The members volunteer in that emergency to assist the government to the best of their ability in the maintenance of law and order and the essential public services, food, heat, light, power, transport, sanitation, etc. Owing to the amount of unrest in the country, the necessity for this organization must be apparent to all loyal citizens.
These men and women were mainly professional people, retired army officers, office workers, and university students. They were to be ready to muster on receipt of the one-word telegram, action. Of the OMS list of 85,000 names, many came from the south of England. A long way away from the industrial centres. In contrast, the unions were ill prepared. Local strike committees were hastily formed and met in rooms like this.
I have not really been here since 1926, 46 or 47 years ago. And this was the room where the Council of Action actually functioned. And we began on the morning of May the 3rd with, what, 2 men and a boy, not really knowing what to do. And what we did was to set up a systematic organization. It was extraordinary how spontaneous it was and how quickly it came into being.
Delegates came from every trade union branch in the district. Trammen, busmen, railwaymen, all the various sections, engineers and so on. And at 11 o'clock, the Council of Action met in the Railway Institute in the centre of the town.
The TUC called out the strikers in waves. The first wave of strikers were to be the transport workers, the printers, iron and steel and building workers, to be called out at midnight on the 3rd of May. Special constables, men under 45, stood by. All army leave was stopped and troops were drafted to London and South Wales, Lancashire and Scotland. Warships anchored off the major ports. The OMS handed its organization over to the government. Overnight, Hyde Park became a food and fuel depot. It was uncertain what the response to the strike call would be. In times of high unemployment, would strikers be prepared to sacrifice their wages and risk their jobs?
Crisis! National emergency! National paralysis!
But at midnight on May the 3rd, most railwaymen finished their shifts and went home, leaving the stations silent and deserted.
We were backing the miners. We felt that the miners had had a very, very dirty deal from the government.
And I remember going back to this small railway station. Even the station master came out on strike with us, which was very unusual at the time.
With all public transport now on strike, people had to struggle to work as best they could. The bicycle enjoyed a new popularity as thousands cycled from the suburbs.
The will to work. First steps in hiking.
Hello, girl. Can we give you a lift?
Thanks awfully.
How far are you going?
There was a spirit of excitement and great good nature. Always, of course, the British man, woman is always best in an emergency. Great good nature. And you never saw a car with less than about 10 people in it, all piled up. And no nonsense about these people driving cars by themselves. Everybody lifted everybody.
The British Gazette, the government newspaper, was published at the offices of the Morning Post in London by a staff of volunteers. It was edited by Winston Churchill. Trade union strike committees produced their own strike bulletins and sold copies of the TUC's official newspaper, The British Worker. This was intended to raise the strikers' morale and to counter government rumours of a return to work. Graves to TUC. All union men on strike, spirits high. Barking to TUC. All men on strike, spirits very high. Overcoat to TUC. All out here. God help us if we lose. London and Liverpool docklands were silent, except for food convoys escorted by armoured cars. The extent of the stoppage is much greater than anticipated. All are anxious to be out and in the fight. The TUC's biggest problem was to persuade workers not called out to remain at work. While some factories closed, others stayed partly open. Since gas and electricity supplies to homes, hospitals, schools and factories were maintained, much of life appeared as normal. Milk and petrol trains, manned by volunteers, still ran. When unskilled volunteers were used for skilled work, however, the results could be disastrous. During the strike, considerable damage was done to many locomotives by enthusiastic but unskilled volunteers. Because the TUC was anxious to avoid confrontation with the government, speakers at meetings were warned to be moderate, and strikers were recommended to relax in the countryside and the parks. TUC's do's for difficult days. Do any odd job that wants doing about the house. Do a little to interest the kiddies now you have the chance. A good walk every day will keep you fit. The strike has been portrayed as a good-natured affair, in which strikers played football with the police. But in many industrial areas, there were arrests and serious outbreaks of violence. In the coalfields, blackleg miners were pelted with bricks, despite police escorts.
One day, we went away down to Birtley New Pit. It was reported that there were some blacklegs that started there. Well, quietly we went away from the full meeting Council of Action, and we marched away down to the stone heap. Now I says, come around onto the stone heap where you've got plenty of ammunition, you see? And about 1:30, the wheels start to go. I says, they're coming up now, the blacklegs. Get yourself plenty of ammunition, there's plenty of stones on the heap here. Get ready now. So when the cage came up to the top and they started coming down, I said, let them get down the ladder to come over to the lorries. And they did. And I says, get stuck into the fire. So they did. Oh, the stones went off that stone heap.
Members of the British Union of Fascists enrolled as special constables. When volunteers and fascists tried to take trams from New Cross tram depot under police protection, there was a prolonged riot. The Emergency Powers Act empowered the police to disperse crowds and break up meetings judged to be unlawful assemblies. In Victoria Square in Hull, where a detachment of Sheffield police had been stationed throughout the emergency, violence is vividly remembered.
The purpose was to clear Victoria Square of all those people and get them home to their beds. Well, you can just imagine a young couple like that, dodging stones. They were throwing stones, smashing windows.
There was no violence. People were just shouting and jeering. In my opinion, it was unprovoked. And I think 3 or 4 dozen local men could have dispersed that crowd with a customary move on please. But no, they went in with such savagery that I'm still embittered to this day at the attitude and actions of the police.
Police attitudes hardened still further. There were 374 arrests in a few days. Sir John Simon, a former Attorney General and Home Secretary, declared the strike illegal. Baldwin described it as a challenge to Parliament. Many moderate trade union leaders, like J.H. Thomas of the Railwaymen, began to have second thoughts. On the 11th of May, the 8th day of the strike, the BBC announced that there was little sign of a general collapse. But now, threatened with dismissal, many bus and tramway men had begun to return to work. Strike instructions had already been issued to the second wave of strikers, the engineering, shipbuilding and electrical power workers, when the General Council of the TUC, which had been negotiating behind the scenes, called an end to the strike.
Just been released from Downing Street that the leaders of the Trade Union Council have called off the general strike.
We had not had any dispatch from the TUC which told us that the strike was in any way over or in any way in danger of being called off. There had been lots of rumours about negotiations behind the scenes and so on, but we discounted them.
I was ready to burst into tears. I almost felt that, you know, the bottom had dropped out of our world, and I had this feeling of it being, you know, a great betrayal of all the sacrifices that everyone had made, everyone that I had seen in different parts of London, particularly in the East End, that here was the end they had fought for, they had got nothing, and this was indeed the great betrayal.
The Daily Herald hailed a workers' victory, but it soon became clear that the TUC had secured no guarantees against victimization, and nothing for the miners.
Victimisation was rife all over. Stanley Baldwin winked his eye, the employers nodded their heads, and the screw was on. I'm not blaming Stanley Baldwin for the depression, but I'm blaming him for the treatment that the workers received from then on.
Ending the strike in this way dealt a savage blow to the labour movement. The miners fought on until November, until starvation drove them back to the pits. Trade unions were bankrupt and exhausted. Many trade union activists lost their jobs, or else found themselves singled out for individual consideration.
Back to work! Back to work! Back to work!
When I got back there, the station master gave me a form to sign. The conditions of my re-entry back to the railway staff was that I signed this form, and that on any future occasion that I did come on strike, that this would signify that I'd have immediate dismissal and would not be re-employed again by the railways.
Disillusioned, many workers left their unions. Others were forced to do so by the Trades Disputes Act of 1927. They did not return until the Second World War had wiped out the effects of those 9 days in May.
Well, that's the end of Daytime on 2 for today. Tomorrow